Hello, and welcome to the book conversation series that's part of the U.S. and the World Workshop at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. My name is Osama Khalil, and I'm a professor of history here at the Maxwell School and coordinator of the workshop. My guest today is Dr. Kyle Burke. Dr. Burke is an assistant professor of history at Hartwick College here in lovely upstate New York, where he teaches modern U.S. and global history. Dr. Burke received his PhD from Northwestern University in 2016 and has held postdoctoral fellowships at NYU and at Temple University's Center for the Study of Force and Diplomacy. His first book, Revolutionaries for the Right, Anticommunist Internationalism and Paramilitary Warfare in the Cold War, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2018. His articles, essays, and reviews have appeared in Jacobin, Diplomatic History, Terrorism and Political Science, H-War, and H-Diplo. He's currently at work on two projects, a history of the transatlantic white power movement and a film documentary about the short-lived white supremacist nation of Rhodesia and its contemporary legacies. Dr. Burke, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
So I'm thrilled to have you here. I want to hold up a copy of your book, which I really enjoyed, Revolutionaries for the Right, again, published by the University of North Carolina Press. And it's a wonderful book. I can't say enough good things about it. And so I'm curious, if you don't mind, one of the things I like to do with the book conversation series, especially for first-time authors, is to give an idea of kind of the germination of the project, particularly, books that are kind of dissertation to book projects. So how the idea for this project originally come to you, and then how did you develop it as a grad student into a dissertation?
Yeah, so the project came to me as a graduate student in my first year at Northwestern. Everyone's required to produce a substantial research paper. And I knew that I wanted to write something about conservatism or the right in the United States. It had been, in part, what I'd gone to Northwestern to do, but I had no idea how I was going to approach that. And in early January, I began messing around in the archives at the Chicago Historical Society, in particular, the papers of Clarence Mannion, who was a leading radio host, conservative radio host in the 50s and 60s. And all of his papers, hundreds and hundreds of boxes were there. And so I just went down to the archive and started messing around. And what I kept coming up against, and what struck me as the most interesting and novel thing that I was finding in the archive, was that on Mannion's programs, and he did about 50 programs a year, at least a third of them were guests from outside the United States. Including many leading statesmen from Central America, from South America, from South and Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. They're appearing on his program, either coming to the United States and being interviewed, or he was sending his daughter or other agents of the program abroad to interview these figures. And I began reading the interviews and thinking about what they might mean in the broader context of the conservative movement in the United States and the story that we know, or think we know, about the rise of the right. And it occurred to me that there is this broader international dimension, both to American conservatism and also this world of right-wing and anti-communist politics outside the United States that often impinged on developments in the U.S. And so I began looking at Mannion's program not as a way to think about how conservative media evolved, but rather about how U.S. conservatives were connected to a wider world outside and how that world shaped their own aspirations, ambitions, their programs and projects at home. And so the Mannion Forum article I published in Diplomatic History, and I continued down the road of that project, learning more about the various groups and individuals that appeared on Mannion's program, which is when I discovered Marvin Liebman as I was beginning to prepare to defend my dissertation prospectus. And as I discovered Liebman, he's a behind-the-scenes player within a variety of conservative groups in the 50s and 60s, and one of the main architects of their international efforts, both as a fundraiser and as an organizer. And so when I discovered Liebman's papers, I was really struck by his involvement with a group known as the World Anti-Communist League, which was an umbrella organization for about 100 different anti-communist organizations all around the world. And Liebman had a long-running, but also often contentious involvement with the World Anti-Communist League. So I began thinking about the world that Liebman and Mannion were a part of. And then I also discovered a guy named John Singlov, who other people have written about. Greg Grandin writes about John Singlov, and others have too. And Singlov was also a member of a different version of the World Anti-Communist League in the 80s, which he tried to turn into a global network to funnel weapons, monies, and supplies to wage paramilitary warfare. And so I began thinking about all these different agents and actors, these various American conservatives who had been engaged in international projects of one kind or another. And I wanted to connect the stories. I wanted to connect the kind of activism that Marvin Liebman was engaged in the 1950s and 60s to the paramilitary activism that John Singlov was engaged in the 1980s. And as I developed that idea, I came to the notion of what I call anti-communist internationalism, or the Anticommunist International, as a way of thinking through not just the connections between these groups, but their shared aspirations, but also the disagreements that could divide them fiercely, and how that version of the right on the international stage operated both abroad, but also shaped how the U.S. conservative movement unfolded at home. So, like many projects, I guess, to put it succinctly, the project started in the archive, and I began tracing out those connections and then building them into something I thought was important and novel.
That's great. I mean, and I think it's a number of the authors I've interviewed, it's a very similar process. And so when you're digging through the Mannion papers, had they been looked at before? Were there other archives that or sources where you started to play with, where like you were the first one to use it, or other cases where you came in and you gave a different view of it than had been viewed before?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the Mannion papers, Nicole Hemmer I think she had completed her dissertation just before I began going to Mannion's papers, and she was very much interested in how the Mannion Forum was a prototype of what conservative media was and what it became into. And she's less concerned, both in the dissertation and then in the really, really excellent book, Messengers of the Right, that came out of the dissertation, with the international dimension. So she had been looking at Mannion's papers, and others had been working in Liebman papers as well, but no one really seemed to care very much about all of this stuff that was happening outside the United States, or was involving non-American actors in the relationships to U.S. conservatives. So it wasn't so much that I discovered something new in terms of an archival collection, but rather began thinking about sets of sources that others had already engaged, and focusing on elements of those collections that they had, if not ignored, kind of left to the side.
As you're making the transition from the dissertation to the book, right? So you've got this great dissertation. How did you start to think about it now as a book, which is always a challenge? And what factors did you start to take into consideration?
So some of that has to do with, I think, how I wrote the dissertation itself. And I was a part of a really great workshop at Northwestern that my advisor had been running for about 2 decades, the Americanist Dissertators Workshop. And within that, there was a strong core of us that really, really tried to focus our writing around narrative and style, which not all dissertations do. There's kind of a set of benchmarks that dissertations have to hit. And, and a lot of that's showing your bona fides in terms of argumentation, historiography, research, and narrative threads can get lost in that kind of writing. And so we were always pushing each other to write something that tells a story and could be engaging. And so the dissertation, for whatever it is, I did my best to have a strong narrative thread within it and to try to fully flesh out the main characters of the story that I was trying to tell. And so when I sat down to turn the dissertation into the book, I felt like I was already well equipped based on how I approached the dissertation, in the sense that I didn't need to reconceive the project entirely, to cut everything that I had written and begin again from scratch, which I know other people have done. And I think that can be a very wrenching and time-consuming process. For me, it was not so much about starting from scratch or getting rid of a lot of what I had, but rather trimming that, getting rid of more jargon, trying to emphasize narrative, trying to refine my own abilities as a storyteller, making sentences shorter, simple things like that. But also did a fair amount of research between the dissertation phase and into the book phase. I was fortunate to have, I guess it was 2.5 years of postdocs after I finished. I had a 6-month postdoc at NYU, a year-long one at Temple, and then I went back to Northwestern for another postdoc, and had very minimal teaching responsibilities during that time, which allowed me to travel a lot, allowed me to edit and write a lot. And so I was able to go to a new set of archives and revisit stuff I had collected before to firm up the case that I was trying to make in the book. And I think I decided to kind of call it with archival research once I began running into the same sets of documents in several repositories and feeling that I had run out the end of the thread, and therefore there was less to be had from doing more work. But much of it was not so much reconceiving the project, but rather taking the project that I had already created and refining it into something that I thought would appeal certainly to academics, but to something beyond that as well. I'm not sure if I was entirely successful in that regard. I think when I look at the book now, there's certain narrative threads that I could have picked up more and extended more. There's certain parts of the book now, as I look back on it, that I wish I had perhaps trimmed. There's, narrating meetings isn't necessarily like the most exciting thing. And there's sexier parts of the story, people with guns doing things, extra legal things and bad things. And that's the kind of stuff that I think is the real meat and potatoes of the book. And I think that's the stuff that readers tend to gravitate towards as well. So point being, I moved pretty quickly from dissertation into book. If I had more time, whether by election or by circumstance, it's possible that I might have made some of those changes later on. But as it stands, I do think there's kind of a firm narrative between it, and I structured it even more so in the book around the two main characters, which are Marvin Liebman and John Singlov, which represent very different iterations of this world of anti-communist internationalism, and two different sets of Americans who tried to lead it, and two different sets of ends towards which they were trying to direct all their international collaboration towards. And so that was the other kind of main thing I tried to do. And I rewrote the conclusion in late 2016 and early 2017 in the wake of the election, and the talk again about a right-wing revolution at home, to make the argument that this discourse about waging a revolution for the right has a much longer history, and that events and actors and parables from abroad have long structured how the American right has conceived of itself, in many ways, paradoxically, as a revolutionary force, which it still does today. I think that's one way to understand the January 6th insurrection is a kind of revolution, a revanchist revolution, but a revolution in the minds of its beholders nonetheless.
Your book sits at this really interesting intersection of U.S. domestic politics and foreign policy. And as you've already, referenced, you've described this coalition of conservative groups and far-right actors that are united, across continents to form this, what they describe as a worldwide anti-communist revolution. And they're specific about that term, as are you. So what was the initial goal of this coalition, and how did it change over time?
So the initial goal and the initial organization comes from anti-communist groups in Eastern Europe that had been forced out after the Second World War into Western Europe, and from a series of beleaguered anti-communist movements in South and Southeast Asia who began meeting with each other in the late 40s and early 50s, collaborating on sharing propaganda. And they began groping towards this idea that in both cases, whether it was China or behind the Iron Curtain, that nationalist movements of one type or another could and should be leading armed revolutions in their home countries to remove leftist or Soviet or communist governments from there and engage in the project of rollback and the reestablishment of whatever kind of society they imagined. And so as they began groping towards that, actors from the United States got involved, and they all began invoking and refining the shared discourse of what an international anti-communist revolution would mean. And by that, they meant simultaneous paramilitary and propaganda struggles being carried out in multiple theaters on every continent, wherever there were leftist governments or leftist movements that were gaining political power. And so the idea being that they would engage in the revolution by waging literal or even metaphorical war against these places. And moreover, that they could share ideas, resources in pursuit of that endeavor. And so they bonded over this notion that what they were trying to do was to roll back communism wherever it might be, while at the same time solidifying the power and stature of already existing anti-communist states. And these states, wherever they may be, Taiwan, for instance, would serve as bases for the anti-communist revolutionary project that might unfold elsewhere. And so they shared this big idea. There were other elements of it too. They tended to traffic in ideas about Christian salvation and free market fundamentalism. But the main glue that bonded them together was the shared notion that everywhere communism existed, they should be doing their utmost to create rebellion or dissent or revolution in those places in pursuit not only of liberating them from communist rule, but the ultimate end game to the Cold War itself would be to force the Soviet Union to engage in a series of wars on multiple continents and therefore ultimately collapse. And so they groped towards this idea. There's a lot of dissension and disagreement about what would come after communism, what the role of the state should play, what capitalism would look like. And so they often feuded, often very fiercely over that. But the shared project of revolution is what bonded them together. And I felt like that was what was really novel as well about what they were saying. And in many ways, not what we would expect is that we tend to think of the right as being both parochial and reactionary. In many ways, it is. But the point I try to make in the book repeatedly is that the people that were engaged in this kind of activity, whether in the United States or abroad, conceived of themselves in revolutionary terms and described what they were doing as an international revolution. And the point is that if we were to take them seriously, their aims and aspirations and actions seriously, then we need to foreground their sense of what revolution might mean in their own context, what their understanding of imperialism might mean as well, which is that there's really only one kind of imperialism after 1945 or after 1960, and that's communist or Soviet imperialism. And therefore, the act of anti-communism becomes not just revolutionary, but a kind of decolonization as well, or kind of anti-imperialism as well. And these definitions and conceptions get really twisted and tortured. They're convoluted. They're often backwards looking. They exist in constant conflict with already existing right-wing states that see themselves as engaging in reaction, but yet they traffic in the notion of revolution. So the discourse itself is very muddy, but I wanted to dive into that. And, I focus a great deal on what they're saying and how they're describing themselves and trying to take that seriously.
One of the key things, as you tell it in the book, that and I thought this was so great, was this, this idea that conservatives view domestic politics and American conservatives as rooted in and reflective of broader international problems. And at the same time, right, they also see the domestic implications of problems overseas. And so some of this comes together, obviously, over race relations. So how does this manifest by the late 50s and early 60s in this mindset of the individuals you're discussing, particularly with the rise of the civil rights movement?
Right. Yeah. So throughout this period, from the earliest parts of the story I tell through the end, U.S. conservatives, like many other Americans, tend to view much of what's happening in their own country through the lens of what's happening somewhere else, and vice versa, which is to say they graft their own understandings of what's happening in the United States onto places and people that may or may not resemble anything that's in the United States. In the case of civil rights and decolonization, there's some really clear connections that U.S. conservatives and white supremacists in sub-Saharan Africa draw together, which is the shared project of maintaining white supremacy, whether in the United States or Rhodesia or South Africa. That conception that both sets of people, Americans, South Africans, and Rhodesians, are engaged in the shared project begins in the 1950s, and it's really strong by the late 1960s as the civil rights movement fully explodes, as decolonization unfolds in Africa, as various nationalist movements not only embrace violence in pursuit of liberation, but also lean towards the left or receive aid from the Soviet Union or from communist China and so on. And so there's a huge vein of writing and thinking amongst the American right that what's happening in the United States, in Alabama or Mississippi or anywhere else really, is best understood in light of what's taking place in the Congo or what's taking place in Rhodesia or Mozambique, which is to say that the ultimate intent and aim of civil rights activists in the United States is a kind of armed assault against the state and against the edifice of white supremacy and all that might mean. And so what's happening with in sub-Saharan Africa is not only reflective, but it's a parable about what's happening at home. And meanwhile, as well, if that's the case, if that what's taking place in the United States resembles what's taking place in sub-Saharan Africa, so too should Americans learn lessons from what white supremacist states and organizations are doing there in order to serve as a bulwark against change at home. And so that's the real affinity that Americans developed for South Africa and Rhodesia, conservative Americans in the 1960s, is that these are activist white supremacist states that are engaged in maintaining the project of white supremacy as it appears to be crumbling at home through apartheid or through Rhodesia's own version of apartheid as well, which many in the United States argue if the United States had followed the course of South Africa in a more complete separation of races, or the idea of Bantustans in the United States, that the present convulsions of the civil rights movement would have been avoided. There's also mythical conceptions that Americans connect and attach to Rhodesia in South Africa, which is in both cases white settlers carved out civilization in a terrain populated by backwards and racially inferior and hostile peoples. And therefore, there's a shared sense of destiny, of power, of development that they view in each other's eyes. And the same thing happens for South Africans and Rhodesians. They look at the United States and they see its own turmoil over race relations in the 1960s, and they view their own countries in that lens. And so there's a shared discourse, but also a shared set of collaboration between Americans, Rhodesians, and South Africans to educate Americans about what's happening in Africa and vice versa. But these kinds of connections of viewing different places in the world as reflective of what's happening in the United States happens everywhere Americans go or everywhere they consider. So Taiwan remains a lodestar for many American conservatives throughout this period, well before and then well after the recognition of the People's Republic of China as being the actual China. Americans look at Taiwan as a source of stability, but also as an example of what a truly anti-communist state looks like. This is what a state looks like when it's organized around anti-communism, when the people are enlisted in the project of anti-communism, when there's anti-communist schools sponsored by the government. The Americans look at Chile and say, this is what a free market revolution can look like, and this is how we can engage as well against domestic enemies. This is how you deal with domestic enemies on the left. When Americans look at Nicaragua and Afghanistan in the 1980s and see various anti-communist movements engaging in armed actions against leftist governments, they say, well, this is what we should be doing at home as well. This is what armed men with guns can do. This is how you make citizens with weapons agents of meaningful change. So throughout this time, every time Americans look abroad, they're always looking back through that lens at home. And that's one of the main themes as well of the book, is that you can't fully understand why Americans are devoted to these projects or what the aims and ambitions they have at home without understanding that they're always being refracted through this international lens.
That's great. So one of the things that I really love about the book, and as you tell it, is when we look at these conservative groups and the intellectuals that are aligned with them, is they're also skeptical about the role of the U.S. government. And I think that's fantastic. And you know, so they have this general skepticism towards the role of the U.S. government, this belief that neither the U.S. military nor the CIA are sufficient, nor will they protect us. Are they sufficient to protect us? So what is their answer?
Well, on the one hand, they're firm supporters of American military power, and yet at the same time, they're deeply skeptical of it for a few reasons. Some of them inherit the views of Robert Taft that crystallized in the Republican Party in the early 1950s, which is that a large military and a large military budget creates a garrison state at home and a burden to the American taxpayer. And they resist that version of statism. And therefore, if the aim or the way the United States is going to fight the Cold War is through what NSC 68 is calling for, which is a massive military buildup, military aid all around the world, that this will pervert the Republican or the Republic state that they imagine at home. And so a better solution in their eyes is not to have U.S. soldiers fighting in one part of the world or the other, but to give money, weapons, and supplies to already existing anti-communist movements, wherever they might be, and let them get on with the dirty work of fighting against communism. And there's other advantages in that framing, which fits into this broader understanding of this is what an international anti-communist revolution looks like: synchronized national liberation movements from the right. That not only would U.S. soldiers not fight and die, but that these movements would be more authentic, more widely supported by their own people because they're indigenous. They're made up of Nicaraguans or Afghanis or Chileans or Chinese people or whoever, right? And so this is how you can manage the Cold War, ensure that the United States doesn't become too big of a state, that the federal government doesn't become too bloated, but also ensure that the project of the Anti-Communist International leads to the ultimate demise of communism. The only way that can happen is with multiple conflagrations all around the world. And yet at the same time, whenever there's major U.S. wars in Korea, later in Vietnam, on the one hand, many of the people that I study, U.S. conservatives in this network, want the United States military to win in Vietnam, but also see that it's not winning in Vietnam. They pin that failure primarily upon liberals in the United States, whether liberal policymakers or on the anti-war movement, and say, well, if we're going to be hamstrung here, the best option is to perhaps withdraw U.S. soldiers and not only allow the Vietnamese to take over the fighting, but really press Taiwan to engage in a region-wide assault against the People's Republic of China, to foment uprisings of the People's Republic of China. And that would ultimately end the Vietnam War, because in their framing, the Vietnam War stems from Chinese encroachments into North and then into South Vietnam. So they have this fractious view of U.S. power. As the decades wear on, especially after the Vietnam War, when many of them presumed that the United States' ability is not only to wage war, but to even engage in the kind of covert war that the CIA had already been doing, which is in many ways what they've been calling for, the arming and supplying of homegrown anti-communist groups. They presume the US government is no longer equipped or able to undertake these kinds of actions. So not only do we have to, but we need to do so off the books and through private networks, because the government won't do so anymore. And in that regard, they borrow a lot from not only the tactics that the CIA had been using in the heyday and the peak of the Cold War, especially under the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, covert war, but they borrow from the actual personnel from those missions, many of whom had also grown disgruntled after the Vietnam War, and they leave and find themselves immediately drawn not only into conservative think tanks and conservative activism, but into paramilitary activism as well.
So quick follow-up on that. So is the question that the US, the CIA, the military won't do it, or that they won't do it well, that the bureaucrats, whether it's in the Pentagon or in the White House, or the press is going to be, mucking around, how much of this is also about kind of, what you need is a couple of stand-up guys, quote unquote, who know what to get done and how to do it, and remove the bureaucracy from it. Is that also running some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So fears about bureaucracy, but which are highly gendered in understanding that bureaucrats are weak-kneed liberals who are simply unwilling and incapable of actually standing up to communism. If they're not fellow travelers, they're simply unmanly. And the way in which the Cold War needs to be won is through masculine action, not just the deployment of soldiers, but individuals who are strong enough, willing enough to pick up a gun and put their lives on the line, citizens turned into paramilitaries. And so those framings of gender of what hard men can do and what soft men are doing in the bureaucracy figures very much into it. And that sense grows dramatically in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. Even as Reagan enters office, there's a presumption that the real architecture of American foreign policy is still being run by weak-kneed liberals in Congress or within branches of the executive department. And so what's needed then is to move beyond them and simply cut them out of the picture altogether.
And so I think what's fascinating about this, as you're describing it, and we tend to kind of do this when we think about, weak-kneed liberals, the way that's being described and the way you describe it in the book is that it's not just, quote unquote, Democrats, or it's anybody effectively who disagrees with them or stands in the way. And so these could be Republicans, these could be Republican members of the Senate. If you don't have what it takes, if you're not willing to do what it takes to stand in the way of communism, then you're part of the problem. You're a fellow traveler, right? You're just as bad as the hippies on campus who are protesting, right?
Right. I mean, some even begin to think of Reagan in that way after 1985 and 1986, is that Reagan, part of his foreign policy, the Reagan doctrine, is that the administration is to provide funding and supplies to about a dozen different anti-communist movements. In some cases, that support is real and it's really consequential, most obviously in Nicaragua and in Afghanistan. But elsewhere in the world, it's tokenistic. It's designed more to placate Reagan supporters who've been calling for this project for a long time than to actually create any change. Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia received such small support, $5 million, $10 million from the administration to do essentially nothing. And so they say, well, Reagan is also in the way too. He's sharing the same set of ideas with us, but in terms of action, there's very little to come. And then people saying, well, he's actually not standing up to communism either. And so, yeah, if you stand in the way of the project, or you are insufficiently committed to the project, you as well then become an obstacle.
You profile, and you mentioned one already, which is Marvin Liebman. You profile two individuals from very different backgrounds. And Liebman is not that well known, but William F. Buckley is. And so they have this shared perspective. And what are their respective roles in what you call the Anti-Communist International, and how do they coordinate?
Yeah, so they're very different people. Marvin Liebman arrived in the U.S. conservative movement after a quixotic journey through the left. He came out of New York's bohemian leftist underground in the 1930s, and he lost his way. And after the Second World War in the early 1950s, he read Eleanor Lipper's Gulag memoir, and overnight he turned himself into a fervent anti-communist, and his former life dissipated And he threw himself immediately into anti-communist activism. And in his eyes, he believed that he took all the strategies he had learned as a young leftist in the 1930s and was now going to bring them into the right, which is to say that the rapid organization of political action groups, and letter writing campaigns, international conferences, all these things Liebman believed that he'd be able to do. And so in that moment, he creates a close friendship with William F. Buckley, who, of course, arrived at his conservatism at birth, as a scion of a wealthy oil family, and the author of God and Man at Yale, and has already established position within the intellectual currents of the right. They become good friends, although strained friends as well, because as I note in the book, Marvin Liebman was gay. William F. Buckley despised homosexual relations between men, and Liebman struggled for about 4 decades to keep his homosexuality secret in the company of Buckley and many others who often disparaged him. Nevertheless, they had a close and working friendship. Liebman's role mainly would be to serve as a treasurer and a fundraiser, and as a behind-the-scenes organizer of a variety of different anti-communist groups. The first main one he was involved with was the Committee of 1 Million against the admission of China to the United Nations, or more simply, to the Committee for 1 Million, which he was the main treasurer and organizer for. And that introduced him to a lot of different personalities in the United States, which then served as a springboard to create a series of fronts, and also began introducing him to people from outside the United States, anti-communist leaders from South Korea, Taiwan, and South Vietnam, where he traveled in 1955 and 1957, from Latin America, where he traveled in 1956 and 1957, and then later from Sub-Saharan Africa, which he visited several times in the 1960s. So Liebman was a behind-the-scenes player, and William F. Buckley's job, as well as Clarence Mannion, too, the radio host, was not so much to organize these groups, but to take the ideas that were being formulated and the connections that Liebman was creating between the United States and anti-communist actors abroad, and introduce them to an American audience. So Liebman was creating the connections and facilitating the exchange of ideas about what anti-communism meant, how different anti-communist movements could pursue this shared goal. And William F. Buckley was using the National Review or firing line to introduce Americans to those ideas, to bring Ian Smith from Rhodesia to the United States, or to bring Carlos Pena-Bato, the Brazilian right-wing admiral, to the United States, and introduce him to American listeners. And the same thing goes for Clarence Mannion. So they're popularizers rather than organizers.
So, you mentioned again, so that those are the intellectuals and the organizers. And of course, there's the other side of your story, which is about the paramilitary guys. So here's General John Singlov, and he's, really important in your story. Who was he?
He represents a very different version of the Anti-Communist International. He moves into many of the same networks that Liebman, if Liebman didn't create them, had helped solidify in the 50s and 60s, all these different bonds between the U.S. right and kindred movements elsewhere. But what Liebman and Buckley were mostly interested was the network itself. That is to say, creating bonds between Americans and their allies abroad, and presuming that basically that would be enough. They tended to favor propaganda, celebrating the actions of some anti-communist movement elsewhere and helping Americans think of their own problems through the lens of that. But that's basically where it stopped. They dreamed of an international anti-communist revolution, but when push came to shove, they weren't doing a great deal to make that happen. John Singlov, however, would take great effort to try to make that happen. And so Singlov was a 30-year veteran of special operations. He joined the U.S. Army in 1942. He was first deployed in France behind Nazi lines to help organize ordinary people as members of the Jedburgh teams to create paramilitary forces that would battle against the Nazis before U.S. soldiers would arrive. And that was basically his MO as a soldier for about 30 years, was organizing armed resistance amongst civilians. He did so in China, he did so in Korea, he would later do so in Vietnam, as well as running an international team of mercenaries and spies and paramilitary-style commandos. And so Singlov did this for a long time, and he's convinced that this is, like Liebman and Buckley and many others were saying, this is the way you win the Cold War. It's not so much by deploying U.S. soldiers, as in Vietnam, which produces a great deal of blowback and dissension and debate. It produces a big anti-war movement, which ultimately makes the war unwinnable. Rather, it's through covert effort and it's through paramilitary organizings and uprising. So he was already primed to think in that way. However, he was one of the people as well that began to presume or assume that in the 1970s, the US government was both unable and unwilling to undertake this kind of action. And the big signal to him for that was the Church Committee hearings held in 1975 and 1976, which released a litany of failed CIA operations and assassination plots and coup attempts, and resulted in some, although not a great deal, but some meaningful change about how the US intelligence community was organized, especially as Jimmy Carter entered office in 1977 and appointed Stansfield Turner as director of the CIA. And Stansfield Turner's basic mode and idea was to remove a lot of this old wood from the agency, all these guys who had been running paramilitary operations, which in his eyes were both morally wrong and a major problem for the image of American democracy in the wider world. The CIA should be doing less of these things. It should focus more on intelligence gathering. And so many of them are simply fired from the agency or fired from the clandestine branches of the US military. Singlov isn't fired so much as he decides to resign after a series of very public spats with Jimmy Carter about his command of UN forces in Korea. So he resigns in 1978. He immediately receives an invitation from the American Security Council, one of these right-wing think tanks that's involved in the Anticommunist International, to become an education field director. And Singlov begins going around the country giving a spiel that the United States is losing the Cold War. It's losing the Cold War because it's not undertaking the right kind of paramilitary action. And this is what the United States needs to do if it wants to win the Cold War. It needs to give the right money, weapons, and supplies to armed movements, and then basically get out of the way. He starts making that argument. That argument gains traction with the Reagan administration. It would become part of Reagan's foreign policy. But meanwhile, Singlov also began moving in the same networks that Liebman had organized and try to make this project real. How can he, as a private civilian now, engage in the project of the anti-communist revolution that he and others so desired? It's by using the same sets of connections he'd gained in 30 years as a special operations soldier, trafficking arms and weapons, and engaging in off-the-books paramilitary operations. So he begins doing that through the world of the Anticommunist International, and so too do many others. Mercenaries and arms dealers begin utilizing these connections to try to actually make war in the wider world.
One part of the book that I really enjoyed, as much as you can say you enjoyed this discussion, is about Rhodesia, right?
Yeah.
So, and its role, and I mean, what I'm so taken by was its role in the conservative American imagination, right? And so, as you have, as you talk about it, there's this intersection between the civil rights movement in the U.S. that you've touched on already, and then of course, what we don't often talk about is the conservative backlash to it, and then how that translates into support for Rhodesia and the Republic of South Africa.
Right.
So, what was that relationship, and then how does it play out? Let's say in the 70s, late 60s.
Yeah. So by the 70s, U.S. conservatives had already been thinking about Rhodesia for about 10 years, and they loved Rhodesia, I would say, even more than they loved South Africa, because what Rhodesia had done in their eyes was particularly novel: to declare independence from Great Britain in order to prevent a black majority government. And then they saw it, and they really identified with Rhodesia's plight, that it was facing two armed nationalist movements, that it was essentially an international pariah. It was recognized by no other states. There was a massive embargo that was crippling much of its trade. And it was a struggling state. And they felt like this beleaguered state represented their own position in the United States. They drew parallels between the position of Rhodesia and the U.S. South. So they already been thinking that Rhodesia is a cause that not only should they aid, but that they saw themselves in. After the Vietnam War, Rhodesia came to represent something along those lines, but even more so, which is that it became a place not only where white supremacist Americans could see themselves, it's a place where white supremacist Americans actually went in pursuit of fighting against communism. So the Vietnam War unleashes a wave of resentment in the United States, and also, not unlike what's happening with John Singlov, creates a wave of disgruntled armed men who return to a society that they feel has changed as a result of the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, gay liberation movements, and all these kinds of things. A society that's also being racked by stagflation, and they feel that their position in America is fundamentally different. Well, what to do about that? The thing to do is to become a real man and go to Rhodesia and fight against communism, to engage in the activity that the United States has abandoned, to stand up for the West. And this is the term that they often use: that you're fighting for the West in Rhodesia. And so about 400 Vietnam veterans, Americans, go to Rhodesia to serve as mercenaries between 1975 and its ultimate collapse in 1980. And they join an international cast of mercenaries coming from across Europe, mostly from Great Britain, but also Portugal, France, Germany, and others, joined the Rhodesian fighting forces in one way or another as infantrymen or as members of the Southern Scouts, and begin the actual project of engaging the war against communism, both in terms of their own set of political priorities, defending white supremacy, resisting the spread of leftist movements, but also for financial gain and a sense of meaning and purpose that they felt they could no longer have in the United States because the United States was no longer the country they imagined it, which is to say a white supremacist anti-communist state.
So that's, we've been bouncing around it, which is the Vietnam War, and it plays a really important role in your story here. And I think what's interesting is and there are kind of two parts to this question. There's the Vietnam War that's in, again, we talk about the imagination of guys like John Singlov and some others, right? Where there's a way they see this war as winnable based on the covert actions that they've taken part in, but they've been held back from winning, right? That narrative carries a lot of power for the right-wing movement, and especially for the paramilitary figures that you discussed. And then there's the other aspect of the Vietnam War that you've just touched on, which is soldiers who come back, and this is not the America that I left, right? I'm not the person who left. And then, of course, there's the third part, which is this idea that the decline of the United States, a perception of the United States in decline, as a reality after Vietnam, and they see that, again, back to one of the central drivers in your story, in kind of this economic stagnation and economic decline that they see in America. So, what is it, in a sense, about the U.S. war in Vietnam, the U.S.'s struggle in Vietnam, that starts to inform these actions in the perspective of the Anti-Communist International? Because arguably this could be the test, right? If we can't stand up for South Vietnam, then we can't stand up for anybody. Would you agree with that?
Right. Yeah, it's the legacy not just of American defeat in Vietnam, but the fact that the United States abandoned South Vietnam as an ally, and the fact as well that many of the American conservatives that were involved in what I call the Anti-Communist International felt this from their compatriots elsewhere in the world. When they talked about the United States and looked at the United States and said the United States is slipping as an anti-communist power, it's no longer can be relied upon. And why should we trust the United States to support us? There's a lot of Latin American leaders, military leaders, and civilians in the late 1970s and early 1980s who were looking at the United States and saying it's basically abandoned its role as the leader of the anti-communist world, and we have to take over. That's what Rafael Videla is saying in Argentina, and that's what Pinochet is saying in Chile. And so Americans feel that loss as well, not just from their own experience that they haven't won the war in Vietnam, that South Vietnam collapsed as a state, that the United States no longer seems very interested in waging those kinds of wars, and that the US people perhaps betrayed their own country and its missions. They're also feeling it from their allies abroad that the United States has lost its position. So how to reclaim it, the way to do it is through paramilitary action.
And I think that's a great point, because it comes back to the early driver you discussed, which is that often when we think about the conservative movement, we focus so much on the U.S., but we don't think about kind of some of the feedback they're getting from the rest of the world saying, you've let us down. Where are you to come help us? And I think that's so important, especially coming out of Latin America, right? In the 70s, where, and you can see it in Taiwan, you can see it in Latin America in the 70s, you can see it, for example, in Indonesia as a response to Vietnam. So, you've touched on this a little bit, but, we had this moment, it's almost primed, right? Nixon is now out of office, Ford is president, and then you start to get these massive leaks about CIA misdeeds over the previous decade or more. And they're coming out of the New York Times and Seymour Hersh. And of course, that then triggers, with everything else around Watergate and kind of constraining executive power, we see two committees that come forward and start looking at the issue of intelligence and intelligence misdeeds, for lack of a better term. So how did the Anti-Communist International respond? Because this seems to confirm exactly what you said. The U.S. military can't save us. CIA can't save us. Look at what's going on. How do they respond to the hearings and the reports that come out?
they see it as a primary symptom of what many began to call the Vietnam syndrome, which is that the United States is now its main role is to just engage in self-flagellation rather than masculine action, and that Americans, for whatever reason, Vietnam primarily, but other reasons too, are no longer able or willing to fight war in the way that they could or should. And so the solution to that is to one, perhaps elect someone who will revamp the intelligence and paramilitary capabilities of the United States, which Reagan traffics in that trope as candidate in 76 and again successfully in 1980. But even then, as well as to take actions into their own hands. And many elsewhere outside the United States begin doing so in the 1970s anyways. The Southern Cone military dictatorships engaged in the project of Operation Condor, which has the authorization of officials in the CIA and the Department of Defense. In some ways, their responsibility because they helped set up the communications network. But Operation Condor, this transnational program of torture, assassination, and kidnapping and terror, was carried out by the Southern Cone military dictatorships as a response to their understanding the United States is no longer going to take the necessary action to fight against leftist subversives in their own countries or in other countries or in Western Europe or even in the United States. So that kind of action off the books, assassinations, paramilitary programs, covert actions is happening already outside the United States. And Americans begin learning from that. And there's actually a set of congrmen and other intellectuals in the United States in the 1970s are saying, we should be doing what the Southern Cone dictatorships are doing. Larry McDonald from Georgia is probably the most notable instance of this, but Jesse Helms as well is saying that the Southern Cone dictatorships are murdering their own people, disappearing them, and they might not be doing that much of it, but if they are, it's probably a good thing, and maybe we could take a page or two out of the playbook, which is a really horrific thought. U.S. congressmen and senators thinking along the lines of disappearance and torture of U.S. citizens.
Yeah, so it's what I find so interesting about when we think about the Southern Cone and their actions, and Kissinger's role in facilitating this, right, as Secretary of State, and you have that, and I think it's one of the things that kind of gets lost in the story here is they want to step in. There's, Kissinger plays these great roles of kind of like acting like, oh, my hands are tied. So, you go ahead and you do this. Carter, from what we can tell, does not favor this, but it's only a 3-year period, basically. And I think what's even more, important, we talked about this several times, the gendered notion of this, the masculine notion. So much of this failure, this Vietnam syndrome, comes to a head under Carter with the Desert One fiasco, trying to rescue the American hostages in Iran, and how much of that sets up the stage for now riding out of the West, this great masculine figure, right? Here comes Ronald Reagan. And so, as you describe it, right, the first part of the Reagan presidency is the zenith of the Anti-Communist International. They finally have the individual and the policies they want. Now, what's interesting is there's been some discussion, we can get into this, I guess, off the side, about how active Reagan was versus, say, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the real kind of driver here. Yeah. And we, not clear when we'll ever learn that more about that, but, so anyway, at a minimum, here's what we know. How did Reagan's policies create fertile ground for the network's actions and a global battlefield? And then, of course, this gets undermined by Iran-Contra. But how was he greeted at the Reagan presidency? And then within a year or two, it's almost fully on.
Yeah. So it happens, I think, in two main ways, both rhetorically and materially. Reagan does more than any other U.S. president to engage the Anti-Communist International and to attempt to make its dream of multiple synchronized wars against leftist governments come true. So Reagan begins trafficking this discourse on the campaign trail alongside his other statements that he's going to revamp the power of the U.S. military. He's going to spend more in the U.S. military, the new weapon systems, larger soldiers. So Reagan's working in both worlds. But as it's clear in the 1980s to Reagan, to many Americans, that a repeat of Vietnam is not possible. The notion of directing more rhetorical and also material energy to anti-communist movements elsewhere becomes more palatable, whether by choice or by circumstance or constraint. So Reagan is seen not just by figures in the United States as being the embodiment of what the Anti-Communist international wants, but is also seen by members outside the United States. Death squad leaders in Central America are hailing his election. The Taiwanese are hailing his election, saying that this is the man that we need in charge of the United States, in part because he's promising to give us aid so that we can get on with whatever war we may be imagining. Reagan famously announces this in what he calls the Reagan Doctrine in 1985, which is that the administration not only is going to fund a war in Nicaragua or Afghanistan, but is going to attempt to do the same thing in about a dozen different theaters of combat stretching across 3 different continents. And the purpose of this policy, as articulated by Reagan, stems from people like John Singlov talking to Bill Casey and others in the CIA in creating an intellectual architecture that the way to end the Cold War isn't through the Strategic Defense Initiative, isn't through the United States going to war in Afghanistan, but it's rather drawing the Soviet Union into multiple unwinnable wars at the same time. And to that extent, Singlov is, if not directly inspired by what Che Guevara was calling for in 1967 with 2, 3, many Vietnams, it's certainly creating his own version of that. The Soviet Union will fight multiple wars on multiple fronts, it'll collapse, and therefore now the world is being ushered into a new age of liberation, freed from communism, freed from Soviet imperialism. Reagan voices that, he borrows those ideas from Singlov, and then as he announces the Reagan Doctrine, the CIA gets on with the task of actually creating this as a global project. The CIA had already been involved since 1979, which Carter authorized, right, the covert sale of U.S. weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen. Reagan expands that dramatically. So by the end of his administration, about $1 billion is spent in Afghanistan. And also Reagan begins expanding U.S. support for the Nicaraguan Contras. And by 1982, congressional amendments come into effect that begin limiting the amount of that support. By 1984, even more so. And so that begins to create the workings of Iran-Contra, that Reagan wants to embark upon this project. He feels hamstrung from using U.S. soldiers abroad, and now he's also feeling hamstrung from engaging in covert action in Nicaragua. So what to do about it? You begin selling weapons to Iran, using the proceeds to finance the war in Nicaragua, and hopefully as well free some hostages in Lebanon, right? This crazy scheme. So Reagan materially and rhetorically helps make the anti-communist revolution that others have been talking about for so long a real possibility. And yet the actions that he's taken to fund the illegal or extra-legal war in Nicaragua ultimately bring about so much scrutiny of this entire world that it begins to chip away at its foundations and ultimately leads to its demise. So by 1987, John Singlov and many others who had been involved in the Anti-Communist International and trying to direct it towards paramilitary actions elsewhere are now having to spend long times in front of Congress, organizing their legal defense, begin turning on each other and trying to throw each other under the bus. And the fact that they're having to spend so much time in and of itself means that they can't be engaged in this kind of action. But also there's now a great more deal of journalistic and congressional scrutiny of these kinds of actions. And if they continue to engage in them, they might not just find themselves facing congressional panels, but they might find themselves in prison. And so they begin scaling back their amount of activity, although in Singlov's case, remaining thoroughly unrepentant about what he was doing and why he was doing it, and continuing to argue that if the United States wasn't going to fight the Cold War in this way, then private citizens like himself should and could engage in the project of making war in somebody else's country through arming, supplying, or fighting even alongside overseas anti-communist forces.
So building on the end of Reagan's term, and I think what's fascinating about him, we touched on this a little bit earlier, is, you know, Reagan by the end, because he has these improved relations with Mikhail Gorbachev, he has gone to Red Square and said, you know, this is no longer the evil empire, you know, and so conservatives are going to start to talk about, well, the old man's lost it. All right, the old man has gone soft on the communists. It's going to put some pressure on the George Herbert Walker Bush administration that comes in the sense that they believe they now have to be tougher on Moscow because Reagan had gone soft, quote unquote. This is one narrative. But very quickly, within a year, the Cold War is over. And it appears to validate the Anti-Communist International. Look, we took the fight to them. We took it in a dozen different places. So how did the members of the network respond? And, you know, because at the same time, it validates them, but also negates the reason for their existence. So I'm curious, how do they respond, and what do you make of that response?
Yeah, there's a really brief moment of triumphalism that we did it moment. The Soviet Union is gone. The world is now be liberated from communism, and they believe they played a big role in that happening. And as soon as that happens, as soon as the Cold War is over and as soon as the Soviet Union ceases to exist, there's no reason for the worldwide anti-communist network to exist anymore. And all these other differences that had existed amongst its various components and actors now boil to the surface. If the way I think about it, the way I describe it at the end of the book is that anti-communist internationalism was the glue that was holding all these disparate elements together. When that glue melted, the whole thing falls apart. And you begin discovering, well, these people are fascists, these people are corporatists, these people, we don't know what to make of them. And there's no longer any reason to have support for them. And for US conservatives, once there's no Soviet Union, there's really not that much of a reason to care about what's happening in Nicaragua or Afghanistan or Angola, unless you have direct financial investments there or something like that, let alone a reason to try to connect all these wars and to try to urge whether the executive branch or individual civilians to invest money, time, and effort on behalf of these movements. Because in Americans' framing, the whole point of the international anti-communist revolution is to get rid of the Soviet Union, right? To make it fight these wars. If there's no Soviet Union, why fight all the wars at the same time? Who really cares? And Americans, throughout, as much as they talked about how much they loved the Afghan Mujahideen or the Nicaraguan Contras, that language was so often self-serving. They had not a great deal of commitment to actually improving the lives of people in these countries. They tended to view them as weapons to be deployed against the Soviet Union or its proxies, rather than as people with their own aspirations. And meanwhile, those movements as well were equally as capable of manipulating American sentiments and feelings for their own purposes to get money or supplies. But there's no reason for the Anti-Communist International to exist if communism doesn't really exist. And so it disappears right at the moment of its triumph, which is both ironic for those that had been invested in the movement, but also ironic, I think, for historians as well, because this thing that I argue is quite important and held all these different actors together ceases to exist, and it kind of vanishes from historical memory as well, because it's overshadowed by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so they disappear. Some of its elements remain together. The World Anti-Communist League becomes the World League for Freedom and Democracy, which is really just a lobbying group for Taiwan's business elites. There's various Americans who are concerned about what's happening in one part of the world or the other, but the overarching project vanishes.
So one of the interesting nodes in the network you described was Soldier of Fortune magazine. And I'm curious, what role did it play here? And what's its status today?
And so Soldier of Fortune was created by one of John Singlov's best buddies, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Brown, who served for a long time in the National Guard, but before then had a checkered history as a mercenary and arms smuggler in the early 1960s. He created the magazine in 1975 after a trip to Rhodesia, where he, like many other conservative Americans, looked at Rhodesia's struggle and said, we can do more to help this. Rhodesia needs soldiers. It needs mercenaries. Where there's a lot of disgruntled Vietnam veterans in the United States, I can start a magazine that will notify them about opportunities like Rhodesia and elsewhere too. And so Soldier of Fortune is his response to a political problem. That Soldier of Fortune will, yes, it'll be a money-making enterprise, but what it will really do is create and inculcate the values of martial masculinity amongst Americans and devote those energies to real-world struggles somewhere else. It can help Americans actually engage in the project of fighting against communism. So Soldier of Fortune would send its reporters into these various war zones to report on either anti-communist guerrilla movements or anti-communist states that were resisting leftist movements, and describe the wars in really lurid and vivid detail for readers at home that read like after-action reports and were countenanced as a kind of alternative intelligence community. You can't trust the CIA, but you can trust Soldier of Fortune magazine. It also served as an ad hoc mercenary recruitment market. The clearest way in which this happens is in Rhodesia, where the recruiting officer of the Rhodesian army, a guy named Nick Lamprecht, who also is doing a similar thing in Europe, is telling Americans very specifically how they can enlist in the Rhodesian army, asking for them to submit their applications, paying for their airfare, bringing them to Rhodesia to train, and then working their way into the army or washing out. The back pages of Soldier of Fortune magazine are filled with job-seeking ads from all sorts of American veterans looking for contract work. It's also filled with people seeking mercenary work. It's also, strangely enough, filled with people seeking contract killers in 3 notable cases. So it fits into this world as both kind of a paramilitary subculture that's emerging in the United States, where, again, Americans are refracting what's happening abroad and at home and thinking about, in both situations, it's men with guns that are the best guarantors of freedom and the ways in which we're going to organize a productive and strong society, and also serving as an actual way through which Americans went abroad to fight wars. In some cases, with decent success, a few recruits from Soldier of Fortune go on and have very storied careers within the Rhodesian army. More often, their attempts are marked with failure and disillusionment. 80% of the Americans that go to Rhodesia end up washing out or simply deserting their units. In other situations, a team of Americans go to Angola, organized through the back pages of Soldier of Fortune. They find themselves outgunned. Daniel Gerhardt is executed by the Angolan government. His other colleagues are sent into prison for 10 years. Soldier of Fortune by the 1980s isn't just doing this, though, popularizing mercenary struggles and popularizing the idea that Americans had a role to play in those struggles. It's also materially aiding them. So Soldier of Fortune under Robert Brown becomes a kind of private military contractor in a moment where that term wasn't in wide use, especially for people engaging in the training and fighting alongside anti-communist movements. So in Nicaragua, Soldier of Fortune assembles a team at John Singlov's behest to go down and train the Contras in demolition and spying and sniper rifles. They do that for about a month. A rocket destroys their camp and they come back to the United States. They go back again. They do this in El Salvador with the Salvadoran military. They train the Atlacado Battalion, which is notorious for its abysmal human rights record and massacres of civilians. They do this in Angola. They do this in Afghanistan, where the Soldier of Fortune team goes there a dozen times between 1982 and 1988. Throughout this entire time, Soldier of Fortune has its International Freedom Fighters Fund, where it's asking its readers to send in contributions that it's very explicitly saying it's going to use to purchase weapons and supplies and ship them into these overseas war zones, which is a violation of the U.S. Neutrality Act. It's happening out in the open. It's if not welcomed by the Reagan administration, it's allowed to operate by members of the Reagan administration in the Department of Justice, who simply turn a blind eye because, as one member of the administration put it, there's a lot of Soldier of Fortune readers inside the CIA and inside the Reagan White House. So it serves in that sense as an adjunct of the Reagan doctrine, allowing Americans to engage in the project of fighting communism somewhere else, both actually, but also, I think more importantly, metaphorically. And it's through Soldier of Fortune magazine that a large number of Americans on the right begin to think about their own society as being one in which they should as well engage in armed action. And that's an idea, and I think you wanted the conversation to go here as well, is that throughout the 1980s, Soldier of Fortune is making the argument that armed Americans are best served by fighting against communism elsewhere in the world. After the Cold War ends, after the Soviet Union disappears, there's still a desire and a need for armed men to resist against totalitarian governments, but that government's no longer the Soviet Union. It's now the United States government, which is serving as a front for the New World Order or some other kind of bizarre conspiracy theory. And so this notion that armed American men have both the right and the duty to engage in violence in service of resisting totalitarianism is now refracted increasingly back into the United States. There's a lot of domestic sources for the rise of right-wing militias, but there's also this international framing that they're viewing themselves through, and also real material connections. Members of right-wing militias like Civilian Military Assistance in the 1980s, which is going down to Nicaragua and training as well, the Contras, is also developing its own programs for apocalyptic wars and showdowns in the United States with the U.S. government. And many of the people that are moving through that world engage in these fantasies about fighting against the U.S. government or overthrowing the U.S. government, joining militia movements or other things, the things that Kathleen Belew describes so well in her book, Bring the War Home. And so, Soldier of Fortune trafficked in that world to help create and popularize this paramilitary subculture, which then increasingly became organized against domestic enemies rather than overseas ones. Soldier of Fortune sadly no longer exists today. I say sadly only because I think it was a terrific historical source. It was my favorite thing that I spent time researching. I spent about 3 months at Northwestern's Herskovitz Library of Africana Studies, just reading every issue of the magazine from 75 through 1990. And it's terrific. There's a lot that's happening in there. So much of it's ideational as well as actual, and parsing out what's real and what isn't real. It was one of the main challenges and one of the most fun things I got to do on the project.
Here we are in the wake of January 6th. There's been a lot of attention on this, but how did the Anti-Communist International serve as its instigator for, you talked about a little bit this with Soldier of Fortune, but for the right-wing militias that come out in the 80s and 90s, and then we see this again, with the war on terror. So, the dip in the late 90s, and then it jumps up again.
There's a few different ways. In an ideological sense, the Anti-Communist International trafficked in a highly conspiratorial view of the world, which is to identify this big menacing enemy that's behind everything, and therefore needs to be resisted not only by governments, by civilians themselves. So it trafficked in that world that ordinary civilians could become agents of meaningful change by picking up weapons and fighting against the totalitarian communist forces that besiege them. It did so as well by benefiting from and exploiting fears about American military and martial decline in the wake of the Vietnam War, which again is something that Kathleen Blue really spotlights in her book, is that it's the experience of loss in Vietnam and the ways in which white veterans of a certain political stripe interpret that as a sign that the United States not only has lost its position as an anti-communist leader, but is now as proof positive that it's been invaded and taken over by communists or others who are intent on destroying the American way of life, or in more radical framings, making interracial marriage compulsory, and doing all sorts of things, right? And the Zionist occupation government and these kinds of things. So the Anti-Communist International primed people to think in that kind of way through a conspiratorial lens, but moreover, in this persistent argument that the best way to resist the encroach of totalitarian forces is for ordinary citizens to pick up weapons and fight against not some force that's far away, but the force that's directly above them, their own government. This is, of course, what Americans had been trying to foment in Afghanistan or in Nicaragua. And so those struggles get refracted in the writings and thinkings of right-wing militias in the United States, as well as proponents of the Second Amendment. People like Wayne LaPierre, head of the National Rifle Association for many, many years. One of the main arguments he made and continued to make about the ownership of weapons in the United States is that it prepares and enables Americans to engage in the process of revolution against a dictatorial totalitarian government at home. And for that lesson, he looked to the wars that the Anti-Communist International had hoped to inspire or work to enable, as well as left-wing struggles too. By the end of the Cold War, you could be a little bit more ecumenical about the kinds of armed action that people might take, but to make the case that anywhere people had Kalashnikovs was a place where there was no longer a totalitarian government, which is a really specious reading of history. It ignores, of course, the fact that many left-wing movements and right-wing movements had access to tanks and planes and all the other things that come with form of military action. But that notion, right, that ordinary citizens with guns can become agents of meaningful change, had been promoted, celebrated, and in many ways made real by the Anti-Communist International. And as that framing merged back into already existing and growing dissent over the civil rights movement and its legacies, and the changing nature of the United States in the 1970s, 1980s, it fed into this broader set of fantasies that the right-wing militias harped on and then acted upon to resist what they viewed as totalitarianism and international conspiracies behind, the liberal elites or whoever they might identify as enemies at home. And there's lots of different enemies they identify. The cast changes at different kinds of times, but in any case, there's a big menacing force out there, and the way to resist it is by taking up weapons and staging, as the people on January 6th said they were trying to do, a kind of revolution, right? And that is the language they use. And as I said at the beginning, part of what I was at in the project was thinking about that language of revolution and where it comes from, especially its international elements.
That's a great place to end. Dr. Kyle Burke, I want to thank you. This is a fantastic book, Revolutionaries for the Right. Thanks for writing it. Thanks for researching it. When the pandemic is over and you're working on two great projects, we hope to have you come visit us up here, and would love to hear more about your work and have you meet our students and our faculty. So please let's stay in touch. But thank you again for doing this. And
thank you. The pleasure was all mine. I really appreciate it.